The woman who belonged. The soft hum of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was a symphony Patricia Langford had grown accustomed to. The rhythmic clicking of designer heels on polished tile, the steady murmur of business professionals speaking in low, self-important tones, and the distinct sound of boarding announcements echoing over the intercom. It was all part of the routine, one she had perfected over decades of frequent first-class travel. She moved with ease through the terminal, her expensive carry-on trailing behind her effortlessly, the smooth glide of the wheels whispering against the floor. Patricia was a woman who belonged. Her posture, her attire, her very presence radiated the quiet confidence of someone who knew her place in the world and expected everyone else to acknowledge it. She adjusted the silk scarf draped around her neck, an old but cherished habit she maintained despite the warmer climate. A woman of her status had to maintain a certain image. Appearances mattered. That was something her mother had instilled in her since childhood. Never let them see you falter. As she approached the gate for her flight to Washington, D.C., she barely acknowledged the economy passengers huddled in tight lines, waiting for their turn to board. That world was foreign to her. She had spent her entire life ensuring that she was never anything less than exclusive. "Good evening, Mrs. Langford." The gate agent greeted her with the kind of customer service smile she expected. She nodded in acknowledgement, barely glancing at the woman's name tag before extending her boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," the woman said. Patricia didn't respond. She had already moved past her, making her way down the jet bridge. Boarding first class was one of the few luxuries she truly enjoyed, not because of the extra legroom or the complimentary champagne, but because it reaffirmed her place in the hierarchy. First class wasn't about comfort, it was about status, and Patricia Langford belonged. As she stepped onto the plane, she inhaled deeply, letting the scent of polished leather seats and subtly perfumed air fill her lungs. It was familiar, predictable, just the way she liked it. She maneuvered gracefully down the aisle, her sharp gaze sweeping over the neatly arranged first-class cabin. This was her space. Until she saw him. A man sat in the seat beside hers, seat 2B. His suit was crisp, navy blue, tailored with quiet precision. He had the kind of posture that suggested control, the kind of confidence that did not demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. His laptop was open, his fingers typing in swift, effortless motions as the glow of the screen reflected against his deep brown skin. Patricia's steps faltered. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her carry-on. She wasn't a woman prone to outbursts, but something inside her recoiled at the sight. Not because he was poorly dressed, not because he was loud or disruptive. Quite the opposite. He was composed, polished, a professional in every sense of the word. And yet, first class wasn't supposed to be like this. She pressed her lips together, regaining her composure as she placed her designer tote down beside her seat. Seat 2A. It was the kind of subtle, deliberate motion that suggested authority, ownership, the kind of movement that signaled she was marking her territory. She took her seat with rigid posture, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck as she stole another glance at him. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence. His fingers continued to type, his attention fixed on whatever was on his screen. He carried himself like he belonged. But Patricia wasn't convinced. She cleared her throat softly, a gentle but unmistakable signal that she was expecting a reaction. Nothing. Her purse, resting against her side, accidentally nudged his armrest. Still, nothing. Her annoyance simmered. She had spent years in spaces like this, in rooms where her presence meant something. She knew when someone was deliberately ignoring her. She sat up straighter, glancing around the cabin. The other first-class passengers, professionals, executives, individuals of status, were already settling in. A flight attendant moved a few rows ahead, assisting another passenger. Patricia's fingers tapped lightly against her knee. She considered her next move, and then she decided. She leaned in slightly, just enough to make her presence known. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carefully polite. a perfect blend of condescension and civility. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man finally looked up. His eyes met hers, unreadable, not surprised, not confused, just steady. "Yes," he said simply, then turned back to his laptop. That was it. No elaboration, no explanation. Patricia's jaw tightened. She glanced around again, expecting, no, waiting, for a flight attendant to notice, to step in, to fix this mistake. No one did. Her fingers curled slightly. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She took a slow, measured breath, exhaling through her nose. Then she lifted her hand slightly, signaling for the flight attendant. A young woman in her early 30s approached with a professional smile. Her name tag read Emily Jacobs. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Patricia forced a small chuckle, shaking her head as if the situation were amusing. "I think there's been a little mix-up," she said lightly. "I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Emily glanced at the man, who had paused his typing again but remained silent. Then she pulled out a tablet, scanning the passenger manifest. "Actually, Mr. Stokes is in his correct seat," she said politely. "Your ticket says 2A, and he's in 2B. Patricia blinked. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest. "That's odd," she said, forcing a smile. "Are you sure?" Emily smiled again, already sensing where this was going. "Unsure, ma'am. Everything looks correct." For a moment, Patricia said nothing. Then she exhaled, her expression smoothing into one of reluctant acceptance. "Well," she said, "I suppose mistakes happen." She turned toward the window, pretending to let it go. But she wasn't done. Not even close. The man beside her, Daniel Stokes, according to the manifest, had already returned to his work. That irritated her more than anything. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't explaining himself. He wasn't playing the game. Her fingers tapped against her knee. Her breath came faster. Her irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. This wasn't right. She had flown first class for decades, and never, not once, had she been put in a situation like this. The man beside her wasn't doing anything wrong. But that didn't matter. Because in Patricia Langford's mind, he didn't belong here. And she wasn't the kind of woman to let things slide. She reached up, pressed the call button, and prepared to set things right. The weight of assumptions. Patricia kept her hand poised just a moment longer after pressing the call button, as if to emphasize the importance of her request. The soft chime overhead signaled for assistance, and within seconds, Emily, the same young flight attendant, appeared by her side again, her professional smile intact. But Patricia was watching closely now. She noted the slight hesitation before Emily spoke, the subtle way her gaze flickered toward Daniel Stokes before settling back on her. Patricia had been around long enough to recognize the nuances of service. She knew when someone was already forming an opinion before they had even heard the full request. "Ma'am, how can I assist you?" Emily asked, her tone polite but not overly accommodating. Patricia adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and drew in a breath, her voice lowering just slightly, as though she were confiding in the flight attendant rather than making a formal complaint. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said smoothly, tilting her head just enough to convey that this was not a dramatic demand, merely a reasonable adjustment. Emily blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Oh, is there an issue with the seat?" she asked, glancing down at the plush first-class arrangement. "Is it uncomfortable, or—" Patricia hesitated just enough to make it seem like she was struggling with her words. She had been strategic her entire life. She knew that sometimes it wasn't what you said, but how you said it. The pauses, the carefully placed sighs, the unspoken implications, they all carried weight. I don't feel comfortable sitting here," she said finally, keeping her voice low, as if this were something she was reluctant to admit. She glanced briefly toward Daniel, who had stopped typing again, his hands now still atop his laptop. He was listening. He wasn't looking at her directly, but she could feel that he was listening. Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am," she said carefully. "Is there something specific making you uncomfortable?" Patricia exhaled, a soft, measured breath. I prefer to sit elsewhere," she replied, not elaborating further. She wanted to let the assumption form on its own. Emily's expression barely changed, but there was a definite shift in her stance. She straightened, her fingers moving over the screen of her tablet as she pulled up the seating chart. "Let me check if there are any available seats," she said. "Just a moment." Patricia sat back slightly, satisfied. This was how things worked. She had been traveling first class long enough to know that if a passenger expressed discomfort, even vaguely, flight attendants would make accommodations. It was about customer service, about making sure the right people were comfortable. Emily frowned slightly at the screen. "It looks like we're at full capacity in first class," she said finally, glancing up at Patricia. "There aren't any open seats available here, unfortunately." Patricia's stomach clenched. She had not anticipated that response. She cleared her throat lightly, willing herself to maintain her poise. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Emily nodded, her expression unwavering. "I can check in economy if you'd like. There might be an open seat there." Patricia's entire body stiffened. Economy. The word alone made her skin prickle. As if she would ever. As if that was even an option. The very suggestion felt insulting. She started, but she caught herself, aware now that other passengers were listening. She wasn't stupid. She could feel the attention on her, the subtle way people had shifted, the quiet murmurs that were starting to spread. She wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. "That won't be necessary," she said instead, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I suppose I have no choice." Emily's smile returned, but it was different now. Less service-oriented, more knowing. She nodded once. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, before turning and walking away. Patricia clenched her hands together in her lap, her breath coming shallow now. She could feel the eyes on her. The businessman across the aisle was pretending to read his newspaper, but she knew he had heard. The young woman a few rows back had her phone angled slightly, as if recording. It was subtle, but Patricia noticed. She noticed everything. And Daniel. He hadn't reacted at all. He had simply resumed typing, as if the entire interaction hadn't happened. As if she were insignificant. That more than anything infuriated her. Patricia was not insignificant. She pressed the call button again. This time, Emily hesitated before returning. "Yes, Mom." Patricia straightened in her seat. "I need to speak to someone in charge." Emily's smile remained professional, but Patricia saw the flicker of something else beneath the surface. Annoyance. Amusement. Either way, it was unacceptable. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight," Emily said smoothly. "Is there something I can clarify for you?" Patricia pursed her lips. "I need to speak to the head crew member. Or the pilot." A murmur spread through the cabin. Someone let out a quiet chuckle. Emily's expression remained unreadable, but there was a slight edge to her voice now. "Ma'am, the pilot is preparing for takeoff and won't be available, but I'd be happy to assist you." Patricia inhaled sharply, her frustration reaching its peak. "I don't feel safe," she said finally, the words carefully chosen, deliberate. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel's typing stopped. Emily's expression hardened. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man wearing a Bluetooth earpiece muttered, "Here we go again." Emily exhaled slowly, straightening. "Ma'am," she said, voice clipped now, "are you saying you feel threatened?" Patricia tilted her head slightly, giving the smallest shrug. "I'm not saying that," she said, her tone light. "I just don't feel comfortable, and I think it would be best if someone else took this seat." Daniel closed his laptop. For the first time, he turned to face her directly. And for the first time, Patricia felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. uncertainty. Daniel didn't look angry, didn't look frustrated, didn't even look particularly surprised. He just looked at her, and somehow, that was worse. Emily's body language shifted, becoming more rigid. "Ma'am," she said, "I already checked, and there are no open first-class seats available." Patricia pressed her lips together, trying to suppress her growing frustration. "And coach?" she asked pointedly. Emily hesitated. "There are 2 open seats in economy." Patricia straightened. "Perfect," she said smoothly. "He can take one of them." A low ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Daniel inhaled deeply, his fingers drumming once on the surface of his laptop before going still. He wasn't arguing, wasn't responding, but he wasn't moving. Emily blinked, as if replaying Patricia's words in her mind to make sure she had heard correctly. "Ma'am," she said slowly, just to clarify, "you want me to move this passenger to economy because you don't want to sit next to him." Patricia nodded once, sitting straighter. "Yes." Emily inhaled sharply, then exhaled through her nose. "That won't be happening," she said. Patricia's eyes snapped up. "Excuse me." Emily folded her hands in front of her, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Stokes has a first-class ticket, just like you. He is in his assigned seat. I cannot, and will not ask him to move." Patricia's face burned. She could feel the tide turning against her, but she wasn't done. Not yet. Because Patricia Langford did not lose. The tipping point. Patricia's grip on the armrest tightened until her knuckles turned white. The hum of the plane's engines, the quiet rustling of passengers settling in, the muted conversations happening in the background. All of it faded as the weight of Emily's words settled in her chest like a stone. That won't be happening. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a rejection of the unspoken rules that had always worked in her favor. Patricia had spent decades moving through the world with a certain level of ease, knowing that her complaints would be taken seriously, that her discomfort would be addressed without question. Now, for the first time, she found herself in a position she didn't recognize, a request denied, her authority questioned, and worst of all, she was on display. Passengers were watching. Not just watching, listening, absorbing every word, forming their own silent judgments. Some feigned disinterest, eyes flicking back to their books, their tablets, their phones, but Patricia knew better. The tension in the air was palpable. And Daniel Stokes still hadn't said a word. He sat beside her with an unshaken stillness, his posture impeccable, his laptop closed now, but his expression unreadable. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't even irritated. He was simply waiting. Waiting for her to push further. Waiting for her next move. Patricia felt a heat rising in her chest, a prickling embarrassment that she refused to acknowledge as shame. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't being unreasonable. She was simply asking for what any respectable passenger would ask for in her situation. And yet, she was being treated like she was the problem. The injustice of it all ignited something within her, something cold and sharp, something that urged her to take this further. She lifted her chin, composing herself, before turning to Emily with the kind of smile she had perfected over the years, the smile she used in boardrooms, at charity galas, at high society functions when she needed to mask irritation with practiced politeness. "I think you misunderstand," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "This is not about him. It's about me. I paid for this seat, just as I always do, and I am simply asking for an accommodation. If there are no seats in first class, then perhaps there's another option. An upgrade for someone else, perhaps. A simple reassignment." Emily's expression didn't waver. "Ma'am, we don't have any upgrade seats available, and we cannot ask a passenger to move simply because another passenger prefers a different seating arrangement." Patricia inhaled sharply through her nose, willing herself to stay calm. "So let me see if I understand correctly. You're refusing to accommodate a paying passenger's request. Is that the standard of customer service this airline provides?" Emily exhaled, patience visibly thinning now. "Ma'am, you are being accommodated. You are in your assigned first-class seat. If you are requesting to be moved, that is dependent on availability. And at this time, there is none." The murmurs around them grew louder. Patricia's shoulders tensed as she realized how public this had become. This was not the quiet resolution she had envisioned. This was turning into a scene. And Patricia did not do scenes. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where another flight attendant stood watching, pretending to busy herself with pre-flight preparations. The pilot had not yet made an appearance, but Patricia was sure that at least some of the crew had been made aware of the situation. She knew how these things worked. Once there was a disruption in first class, it became an issue. She turned back to Emily, lowering her voice to a near whisper, but making sure it still carried the weight of authority. "Let me be clear," she said, her tone dropping into the kind of controlled condescension that had gotten her what she wanted for years. "I am not asking. I am telling you that I do not feel comfortable. And if I do not feel comfortable, then it is your responsibility to address that. Do you understand?" The words hung in the air like a threat. Emily's jaw tightened. She did not shrink, did not stumble over her words, did not rush to fix the situation the way Patricia had expected. Instead, she straightened and said, "Ma'am, we take passenger safety and comfort very seriously. If you are saying that you feel unsafe, then I am required to escalate this to the captain, and that may result in further action." Patricia's heart skipped. She knew what that meant. The unspoken consequence, the veiled warning, further action. The murmurs turned into open whispers now, a few passengers exchanging looks. The businessman with the Bluetooth across the aisle shook his head slightly. The young woman a few rows back tilted her phone a little higher. Patricia's breath hitched. This was not how this was supposed to go. The power she had assumed she held was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she couldn't seem to grasp it back. She could feel it now, the weight of the judgment pressing in from all sides, the unspoken question in every pair of eyes that turned toward her. Why is this woman so determined to have him moved? And worse, they already knew the answer. Emily was still watching her, waiting. The final chance to stop this. But Patricia didn't stop. Because Patricia did not lose. "I don't feel safe," she said finally, her voice louder now, sharper, designed to be heard. The reaction was instant. A man 2 rows ahead exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The businessman across the aisle muttered something under his breath. And Daniel moved. Not in the way she expected, not in the way she had wanted. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He didn't fidget or look uncertain. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Patricia felt something she had not felt in a very long time. A flicker of doubt. A tiny seed of fear. Because what if? Then he pulled it out. A leather badge case. He flipped it open. And just like that, everything changed. A gold emblem caught the overhead cabin lights, the letters stamped across it unmistakable. FBI. The air inside the plane shifted. Passengers who had been murmuring only seconds ago were now completely silent. Emily's face remained composed, but her eyes flicked down to the badge for a split second before returning to Daniel's face. Daniel was calm. Too calm. As if he had done this before. As if this was nothing new to him. As if Patricia's entire existence in this moment was not even a cause for frustration, but merely an inconvenience. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, utterly unreadable. "Would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Patricia's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth. And nothing came out. Daniel didn't move. He didn't blink. He just watched her. And for the first time in her life, Patricia Langford had nothing to say. The silence was deafening. Someone let out a low whistle. The businessman across the aisle chuckled. The young woman with the phone. She zoomed in. And Patricia knew this moment would never be erased. The unraveling. Patricia Langford sat frozen in her seat, her mind scrambling to process the impossible turn of events. She had come into this flight with an expectation, an assumption that things would go her way as they always had. She wasn't a fool. She knew how the world worked. She knew that her discomfort had always been enough for people to bend the rules, to cater to her whims, to ensure that she was accommodated without question. But now, sitting mere inches from a man who had just flashed an FBI badge, she felt the foundation of her carefully cultivated confidence begin to crack. The weight of her own actions pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. She had no words. Daniel Stokes still hadn't moved. He still hadn't raised his voice, hadn't given her the angry reaction she had subconsciously been bracing for. He simply held his badge open, watching her with that same unreadable expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't even irritation. It was something else entirely. Something that told her that whatever she thought she could get away with today, she had already lost. A ripple of awareness spread through the cabin. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick with a tension that had shifted in an instant. What had begun as whispered exchanges among the passengers had now solidified into something undeniable. A reckoning. The businessman across the aisle leaned back, shaking his head, a smirk playing at his lips. "Well, ain't that something?" he muttered under his breath, though not quietly enough to go unheard. Patricia's hands clenched in her lap. Heat crawled up her neck, a mixture of humiliation and sheer panic bubbling beneath her skin. She had made a terrible, terrible miscalculation. Her usual tactics, the carefully chosen words, the polite but pointed complaints, the veiled implications, had backfired spectacularly. She had played a game that she thought she controlled, only to find out that she had been checkmated before she even knew the rules had changed. Emily, the flight attendant who had stood firm against her, now had an entirely different energy. Gone was the carefully maintained neutrality, the forced politeness that service workers use when dealing with difficult passengers. Now, Emily was in control. She turned to Daniel, her posture shifting slightly. "Mr. Stokes," she said, her voice smoother now, more professional. "Is there anything you need at this moment?" It was subtle, but the shift was obvious. The authority in the conversation had changed hands completely, and Patricia wasn't the one holding the power anymore. Daniel finally moved. Slowly, he snapped the badge case shut and tucked it back into his suit pocket. He exhaled lightly, stretching his fingers against his laptop's keyboard, as if this entire ordeal had been nothing more than a minor annoyance. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I think I'm good." He didn't even look at Patricia when he said it. He didn't need to. The humiliation was crushing. Patricia's ears burned as she forced herself to stare straight ahead, her hands curling into her lap. The urge to fix this, to explain herself, was nearly overwhelming. She wanted to say something, anything, to regain some sort of control over the situation. But what could she possibly say? What excuse could she make that wouldn't sound pathetic, that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was, a desperate, last-ditch effort to justify behavior that had already condemned her in the eyes of everyone around her? A young woman who rose back cleared her throat and lifted her phone slightly higher. It was a small movement, one that should have been insignificant. But it wasn't, because Patricia realized she was still being recorded. Her pulse spiked. Her body went rigid. Of course someone had filmed it. Why wouldn't they? This wasn't 30 years ago, when an embarrassing moment could be contained within a single room, confined to the judgment of a few onlookers who would eventually forget. This was 2025. This was the age of viral justice, of public callouts, of social media trials that didn't end when the flight landed but instead began the moment footage hit the internet. Patricia could already see it, her name attached to a trending hashtag, strangers ripping apart her character, her reputation dissected in real time by people who didn't know her but would be more than happy to ruin her. Her mouth went dry. Emily, clearly aware of how much damage had already been done, straightened her posture. She folded her arms, her voice professional, but laced with quiet finality. "Ma'am, we are about to taxi," she said. "I need you to confirm that you will remain in your seat for the duration of the flight without further disruption." Patricia felt the weight of every set of eyes on her. The businessmen across the aisle, the young woman recording, the murmuring passengers just beyond her row, and worst of all, Daniel Stokes, who wasn't even looking at her anymore. She had become nothing to him. And somehow, that was worse than anger. Patricia swallowed the lump in her throat, barely managing a nod. "Yes," she forced out. Emily didn't thank her, didn't offer her a comforting smile. She simply gave a single nod, turned on her heel, and walked away. Patricia exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of humiliation settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The plane lurched slightly as the engines powered up. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, securing trays, ensuring that everything was in order before takeoff. The businessman across the aisle went back to his newspaper, though she was sure he was still enjoying every second of this. The young woman with the phone lowered it, her fingers typing quickly, no doubt posting the video before they had even left the ground. And Daniel reopened his laptop, typed a few words, didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her existence, as if she wasn't even worth his attention. Patricia's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, needing to check, needing to see if it had already spread. Her worst fears were confirmed the moment she unlocked her screen. Notifications, missed calls, texts, social media on fire. Her name, her face, the moment she had sealed her own fate, recorded, shared, dissected by strangers who would never let her forget. The plane lifted off the runway, carrying them into the sky. But Patricia's world was already crashing down. The freefall. The moment the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Patricia Langford's grip on reality began to slip. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of newspapers and the muffled conversations of passengers who had long since moved on from the spectacle she had created. But for Patricia, the silence was deafening. It felt like every breath, every movement, every minuscule shift in posture was being scrutinized by the unseen eyes of the internet. She had never truly feared social media before. It was something she had considered beneath her, a tool for the younger generation to amuse themselves with meaningless viral trends and gossip. Her world, the real world, was built on connections, reputation, and exclusivity, things that couldn't be undone by a single misunderstanding. Or so she had thought. Her phone sat in her lap like a live grenade, vibrating relentlessly with notifications. She hadn't dared open them yet. She wasn't ready. But deep down, she knew what awaited her. The young woman recording from 2 rows back had been relentless, her phone angled perfectly to capture the exact moment Patricia had said the words she could never take back. "I don't feel safe." In the past, that phrase had been a weapon. A simple, powerful phrase that had always gotten her what she wanted. It was subtle, elegant, nearly impossible to challenge outright. But for the first time in her life, it had backfired. Spectacularly. Because this time, she had used it against the wrong man. And the world had seen it happen. Patricia took a shallow breath, willing herself to remain calm. She couldn't let herself unravel. Not here. Not now. She glanced at Daniel Stokes from the corner of her eye. He hadn't spoken a word since putting his badge away, hadn't acknowledged her, hadn't so much as shifted in his seat. He was just working, as if nothing had happened, as if she were an insignificant inconvenience. That realization burned deeper than anything else. Daniel didn't need to win this situation. He had already won by simply existing beyond it. And Patricia, she had lost. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and swiped to unlock it, finally bracing herself for what awaited her. The screen was chaos. Her name was trending on Twitter. Not just trending, exploding. Hundreds of thousands of tweets. The video had already racked up over 2.3 million views in less than an hour. The comments were merciless. Another entitled woman who thought she could get away with it. Not today, Mom. She really thought the universe would bend to her will. And then, FBI. This is why we record everything now. Oh, her life is over. Patricia's stomach clenched as she scrolled further. The video wasn't just spreading, it was mutating. Memes, screenshots. People had taken her stunned expression and plastered captions over it. When you realize you tried to racially profile an FBI agent and now your whole career is in flames. Patricia Langford, the Flight Karen Chronicles. And then the worst part. Her name. Someone had found her name. It was now attached to the video. Her name is Patricia Langford. She's on the board of the Marston Foundation. Let's see how they feel about this. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just online outrage. This was real life. This was her career, her connections, her entire standing in the community. And it was slipping through her fingers at breakneck speed. She clutched her phone tighter, willing the words on the screen to disappear. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't fair. She had built a life out of careful, calculated decisions, out of knowing the right people, out of ensuring that she was always in control. She wasn't supposed to be on the other side of this. She wasn't supposed to be the one losing. She took another shaky breath and opened her messages. There were dozens of missed calls. Her sister, her colleagues, a number she recognized as belonging to the Marston Foundation's board chair. Patricia's pulse spiked. She could already see it coming. The forced resignation, the PR nightmare, the press releases scrambling to distance themselves from her. Marston prided itself on inclusivity, on diversity, on progress. And now, she had just become a liability. Her phone vibrated again. A new text. It was from her sister. Patricia, I don't know what you were thinking. Call me. Now. Her throat tightened. She wanted to fix this. She wanted to explain, to control the narrative, to somehow undo the damage. But how? How could she explain something that was caught on camera, that was being analyzed and torn apart by millions of strangers? She swallowed hard and pressed the power button on her phone, shutting off the screen. Maybe if she didn't see it, it wouldn't be real. But deep down she knew. It was very, very real. And it wasn't going away. The rest of the flight passed in a suffocating haze. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything but the impending disaster that awaited her once they landed. The plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., and Patricia stared out the window with empty, hollow eyes. Her entire life had been built on the idea that she was untouchable, that she was above consequences, that the world would always bend in her favor. But now it was free-falling out of her control. And for the first time in her life, Patricia Langford was powerless. The reckoning. The wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac of Reagan National Airport with a dull thud, but for Patricia Langford, it felt like the crash landing of her entire life. She sat rigid in her seat, her heart hammering as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival and thanking the passengers for choosing the airline. She barely heard a word of it. Her mind was already spiraling, calculating the damage, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment anymore. This wasn't just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a well-crafted apology or a carefully worded press release. This was a catastrophe. The moment the flight attendants gave the signal that passengers could disembark, Patricia grabbed her designer tote and shot to her feet, desperate to leave the scene of her humiliation before anyone could stop her. But the young woman who had been recording 2 rows back was already standing, phone in hand, whispering something to the man beside her. Patricia's pulse spiked. She knew what they were saying. She knew the look they were giving her. There she is. That's the woman from the video. She didn't make eye contact. Couldn't. Daniel Stokes, on the other hand, was in no hurry. He remained seated, scrolling through his phone with the kind of effortless ease that suggested he had already moved on from the ordeal. For him, This wasn't even a moment worth remembering. For Patricia, it was the moment that would define her forever. As she hurried toward the exit, she barely noticed the businessman with the Bluetooth headset giving her a pointed smirk, or the way one of the flight attendants shot her a look that could only be described as satisfaction. By the time she stepped into the jet bridge, her hands were slick with sweat. She needed to get out of here. Now. But the moment she emerged into the main terminal, her worst fears manifested before her eyes. A small crowd had gathered near baggage claim. Not a massive, frenzied mob, but enough. A cluster of reporters, cameras, a few curious bystanders lingering nearby. A woman in a navy blazer stood in front of a cameraman, reading from her phone. The viral video, now being called The Flight Incident, has already garnered over 4 million views, with people online identifying the woman involved as Patricia Langford, a board member of the prestigious Marston Foundation. The fallout has been swift, with calls for her resignation mounting by the hour. Patricia's breath hitched. 4 million views. Her name was out there. Her face. She hadn't even left the airport, and the world had already decided her fate. Panic clamped around her throat like a vice. She spun on her heel, desperate to leave before they noticed her. But she wasn't fast enough. A voice rang out above the hum of the terminal. Wait, that's her. Patricia's stomach dropped. The reporter's head snapped up. The cameraman turned. And then, chaos. A flood of movement. Microphones, cameras, flashing lights, questions being shouted over each other. Ms. Langford, do you have a response to the video? Are you stepping down from the Marston Foundation? Do you regret trying to have an FBI agent removed from first class? Her feet locked to the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. She had faced board meetings filled with CEOs, had spoken at elite fundraising galas, had once been the woman who controlled the narrative. But here, she was a target, a spectacle, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. A hand grabbed her wrist. She gasped, twisting away, until she saw who it was. Her sister. Lisa Langford, sharp-eyed and furious, yanked Patricia away from the growing media storm, dragging her toward the nearest exit with the kind of force that suggested this wasn't just about saving her from the cameras. It was about getting her out before she humiliated herself further. They pushed through the automatic doors, stepping into the sticky heat of the D.C. evening, where Lisa's car was parked at the curb. Get in, Lisa snapped, shoving the passenger door open. Patricia didn't argue. She collapsed into the seat, hands shaking, her mind a blur of panic and disbelief as Lisa slammed the door shut and marched around to the driver's side. The moment the doors were sealed, Lisa whirled on her, eyes burning. "What the hell were you thinking?" she hissed, voice sharp as a blade. Patricia's throat was dry. I didn't. Lisa didn't let her finish. "You do realize your entire life just went up in flames, right?" she demanded. "This isn't some boardroom dispute you can smooth over with a few well-placed calls. This is the internet. This is the world seeing you for what you just did." Patricia flinched. "It was taken out of context," she said weakly. "I didn't mean." Lisa's laugh was bitter. "Oh, is that what you're gonna go with? Out of context? Because from what I saw, the context was pretty damn clear." Patricia's breath shuddered. She had never seen her sister this angry before. Lisa yanked her own phone from her purse, turned the screen toward Patricia. "Do you have any idea how fast this is moving? It's not just Twitter. It's CNN, MSNBC, Fox, TikTok, Facebook. There are already calls for your resignation. Marston is scrambling to distance themselves from you. Do you think they're gonna protect you?" Patricia's blood ran cold. She had been on the Marston Foundation board for years. She had helped shape policies, had moved in the highest circles, had built relationships with some of the most powerful figures in philanthropy. And now, because of a moment of arrogance, it was all crumbling. Lisa took a breath, trying to steady herself. They're going to issue a statement by morning. And trust me, Patricia, you're not gonna like it." Patricia's hands curled into fists. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had always been the respected one, the admired one. But now she was a pariah. A woman whose name would forever be linked to one viral moment, a moment that could never be erased. Lisa's voice softened just slightly. "You need to understand something. There's no fixing this. There's no PR spin that's going to make people forget. The only thing you can do now is accept it and figure out how to live with it." Patricia refused to believe that. She wasn't one of those people. She wasn't someone whose entire existence could be shattered by a single mistake. And yet, as Lisa pulled onto the freeway, the glow of the city lights flashing through the windshield, Patricia finally checked her phone again. The video's view count had climbed to 6.7 million. And the top comment: "This is the face of entitlement. This is the face of consequences." For the first time, Patricia Langford understood. She wasn't just losing her reputation. She had already lost it. And there was no coming back. Not from this. The reckoning had arrived. And she had no one to blame but herself.